All right, hello everyone. Today on the show we are joined by Conservative MP for Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry, and Party-Caucus Liaison for the Conservative Party, Eric Duncan. How's it going?
Doing great. Anxious for this interview. Let's get to it.
All right. So, for our listeners, what do you do in your role as MP and even your leadership role for the Conservative Party?
For sure. So I always appreciate that question, and I do a lot if I'm speaking at high schools or post-secondary, even to the members of the general public. A lot of things that people see us do on the parliamentary side are kind of maybe half of what actually goes on in the day-to-day. It's a full day all the time. There's our parliamentary work in the House of Commons where we're going, debating legislation at committee, asking questions and doing the work on Parliament Hill, which is a key part of our job. The other thing people may often see is at community events. So it's not in the job description, but I've always said at a federal level as a member of Parliament, we have a responsibility of going out and supporting volunteer groups and businesses that are opening or expanding or celebrating an anniversary, and kind of being a bit of a liaison or community leader in the sense of thanking volunteers, recognizing milestones, and kind of boosting and boasting about your local community. The other thing about MP work that I say is also important is our constituency office work. The federal government is very big and there's a lot of programs, and people often can get lost if they're dealing with Canada Revenue Agency, their passports, CPP, immigration issues. So a staff team and a good setup that we've got there is that when people are trying to access federal programs or pay their taxes, we can be a point of contact to fix what something might be broken in the system. So those are just a few of the different things on the MP side. What I'd say in the Party-Caucus Liaison side, I call it a lot of inside baseball, but that's managing all the elected MPs that are serving as Conservatives in the House of Commons and connecting in the back and forth with our party headquarters just a few blocks away in downtown Ottawa. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is team building and skill building. We need a lot of staff, we need a lot of people, we need in our jobs as MP, public speaking, running meetings, communication. So I try to coordinate a lot of the training to make sure all of our members are constantly upping their game and that we're trying to build the best team possible.
Okay, and before we get to the politics and policy, so as I just handed you a little piece of the pamphlet there, do you feel that gives people more of a voice in the community, and do you get good feedback from the community on that?
Yeah, we do. So there's a few actually, which is good. The mailer that we do and giving the chance for people to respond, I think is key for keeping a pulse on what people are thinking in Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry. I try to get to a lot of community events. And I mentioned the point about being out in the community and recognizing businesses and thanking volunteer groups and supporting their fundraisers. But also it's a good pulse check for people. When you're out, people are talking about the latest issues, what's important to them. They see, they recognize me, hey, how are you doing? And they'll make a comment about, oh, that's crazy that the Liberals on the Beijing election interference, I can't believe they didn't do this, or I can't believe they're getting away with this, or can you believe the price of gas and the carbon tax? The mailing's the same way, where I read every response that comes in. We get hundreds of them. I respond with a letter that has the person's address, but I write a personal comment on every one, acknowledging and maybe making a comment of what they provide. So it does give a good sense of feedback. We track how many we get back. We track what people are saying or how they're answering it. That's one way. When you have 115,000 people, a population nearly between around 100,000 electors, you have to do those types of things to get a pulse.
Okay, and you mentioned the carbon tax. So inflation is high and Conservatives already seem to know what is causing some of it. So Conservatives believe that the Liberals' carbon pricing system, also known as the carbon tax, is causing some of the record high inflation. On paper, the carbon tax is not a bad idea as long as it's working and that people get money back through rebates. Different stats say it isn't working, and even government officials claim that people pay more than they get back through rebates. So would a Conservative government repeal the carbon price completely, or would you guys amend it so that would still somehow work in doing what it's supposed to do?
So let's get to the root cause of what the argument of a carbon tax was done. The one downside after 8 years of Liberal government, there's a lot that needs to be fixed, but also gives them a track record. Okay. They claimed whenever they were coming into government, we're going to create a carbon tax that's going to lower emissions and fight climate change. Now that they've had this for several years in, It's not lowered emissions in any way. So their track record and the facts start to speak for themselves of where emissions continue to go up, not down. Every target they've set for themselves, they're now not in these hypotheticals. If we form government, we would do this. We could look at the actual numbers. So it's not actually lowering emissions. It is not meeting any targets they've ever set for themselves. They've never met one. So it's failed on the one sense. What it has created is a cost of living issue, right? We have 40-year high inflation, and there are many domestic factors and made in Canada reasons that's happening. The amount of money the federal government went into debt on, but the carbon tax is not helping. And yeah, people are not getting rebates back. And so I actually think we said too, this is about tax revenue as opposed to any sort of environmental plan. To answer the carbon tax hasn't worked. We've said we are going to repeal it. It actually drives up inflation more. And I'll give a quick example on this, Nolan. And I've said this in the House of Commons. We talk about these rebates. They don't add up to be enough in the first place for families. But think of Mary's Restaurant in Winchester. Think of Lost Villages Brewing in Long Sault. They are paying more in their utility bills. They're paying more to transport their goods to get in, and it's driving up, adding up their costs. Businesses get zero rebates. So what happens when you go to the restaurant, Mary's Restaurant, and you order a pizza, and they now have higher transportation costs to get the food in, they have higher utility bills and electricity bills to run the restaurant, they bake that into the price of the pizza that you're buying, no pun intended. And so you're not paying a direct carbon tax, it is driving the cost of everything up. I always preface, and I kind of criticize and attack the carbon tax, show how it's failed. It doesn't mean we can't lower emissions and tackle climate change. What we've said is there are investments in technology that we can do on a major scale that can actually lower emissions and make a meaningful difference without hitting people in their pocketbooks. So carbon capture and storage, we actually have some of the best environmental protections in oil and gas and LNG and all these things, better than any other country in the world. And lastly as well, our energy. There's so many projects scrapped in Quebec, hydroelectric dams, a clean form of energy. Build those, that lowers emissions, so we don't have to rely on coal. And those are examples of where we can invest in technology and actually address the root cause of the problem. So there's the pitch of attacking the carbon tax. What would you do differently? Here's how we can actually lower emissions.
Okay. And your party has criticized, criticized Bill C-11. Most of us know what Bill C-11 is, but for those who don't, would you be able to explain what the bill does now that it is in law and what concerns you and other conservatives?
So I always start of what the government says, and I break that down and actually go where it's at. So the government says this is about Canadian content. It's about promoting Canadian movies and film and all these artists online. And the irony is, when we look through this large piece of controversial legislation, if you go online and do a Control F search, they actually don't even define what Canadian content means. So for an example, the perfect example, if you're a Leafs fan, a couple of years ago, they did a documentary series following the Leafs around, filmed by a Canadian hockey team based out of Toronto and their away games. All the filming crew were Canadian. All the editing and everything was done in Canada. Yet they don't deem that Canadian content because it was aired on an American station originally. The definition is broken. So this whole idea about we need to create more Canadian content is nonsense because they can't even get the basic definition figured out. Where the issue and the controversy is, they're going into a whole new can of worms that we don't need to get into. One of the first countries in the world to do this. If you were to go online now searching for this podcast, you go to Google and you type in whatever you want, the best search results are the ones that are most popular, most clicked on. The government's actually proposing on every online search engine that operates in Canada, so it'd be Google, YouTube, the list can go on. You can go on and say, social media apps and so forth, Instagram, everything that you search is going to have a new filter in there that's going to have a group of bureaucrats behind closed doors decide, well, we like this Canadian content, so when Nolan searches Canadian podcasts, this is what we want to go to the top. Not what's most popular among Canadians or the public or anything. They're creating these secret algorithms. Two problems. It's censorship because they're not even formulating what their criteria is. They're making all these decisions of what goes up and what goes down in search results behind closed doors. But I say this to somebody that thinks, oh, it's maybe not a bad idea. The number of bureaucrats, think how big the internet is. Google and Facebook and YouTube, all these things I just mentioned, they are massive, massive platforms. They're going to require thousands of bureaucrats to administer this program. So I say to people, it matters for a few reasons. I believe in freedom of expression. People should be able to search and have their results returned unfiltered. And from a spending priority, the amount of money it's going to cost to oversee this, it's part of the reason we're $40 billion in debt and our national debt's doubled to $1.2 trillion. If Canadians had a choice between getting a new mental health service and SDNG that can help address mental health, we can get some addiction treatment beds to help people that are dealing with alcohol or drug issues, people would prefer their dollar go there before this whole C11 scheme.
Okay, and the Senate introduced various amendments at the Senate stage that would put it into law that the government would not control user-generated content through Bill C11. The Liberals turned down those amendments and basically said, trust us. So if those amendments were put into law and the bill would not control user-generated content, would Conservatives consider supporting the legislation?
I love the line. I tease people sometimes. I'm a politician, trust me. And that's exactly why I think, and I'd say frankly with the Liberals in the last couple of years, trust in government over some of the decisions the Liberals have made, the divisiveness that they've done of pitting people against each other. I think trust in government and government institutions has never been lower. So it's a real bad time to go on C11 and say, just trust us. We can do this, when there's many examples about the pandemic, vaccination status and different things of where they've tried to wedge and divide and attack people on that. To the question, there's more issues. User-generator content, they could have provided that assurance and that clarity. They refused to do that. If it wasn't about user-generated content and it was exempted, they would have allowed that amendment to go through. It's because they're hiding something and they'd rather seek forgiveness than ask permission for it explicitly through the whole process. There are other issues. This just goes back to the fundamentals. We all want Canadian content. We want more Canadian films and people to have access to it. But C11 is not the answer. And I go back to, if people have the choice and see how many bureaucrats, they haven't answered that, by the way, but they're going to be hiring a whole new offices full of bureaucrats to go and look and see what people are, the search results of all these companies and tracking it and monitoring it, deciding what goes up and down. That's the bigger issue as well. User-generated content's one thing, but the bigger issue is, of all the priorities we've got, and we're going to add already to our debt and deficit and the size of public service, this is not a priority whatsoever. We could address Canadian content, modernize it, without a big bureaucracy in all this.
Okay. Now, more of a local issue. We've all heard about the new IRCC processing center that has taken over one of Cornwall's top-performing hotels with very little consultation or notice. So you've discussed this issue heavily, but the federal government hasn't really discussed it either, including even your leader of your Conservative Party and other ministers. They haven't really discussed what you've been bringing up. So do you think it should be more of a well-known issue, even by your caucus in the House of Commons?
Sure. So because it was a local issue impacting us in Cornwall, one of my Conservative colleagues in Niagara Falls, Tony Baldinelli, they were facing the exact same thing. So Pierre Poilievre went out with the closing Roxham Road to end the illegal immigration process. It was diverting people from albeit a broken national system. People are going through an illegal route and using it in record numbers because how broken our national system is. Pierre spoke about that and said we need to close Roxham Road. I will note, Justin Trudeau, they mocked him and said, they want to build a wall, and that's not possible. A month later, they did exactly what we asked them to do and told them they should do. So Pierre has given local MPs like myself that are impacted by the chaos of these policy decisions to go out and speak on it and be the local voice on this, which I think gives a good context of what's actually happening on the ground. What I'm going to say, or what I would say is that there's so many issues and complications with immigration. The core is the major issue here is our system is backlogged and broken. There are 2 million people in a backlog waiting to get processed. If it's temporary foreign workers, if it's people looking for visitors visas, family sponsorships, permanent residency, applying for Canadian citizenship, refugee process, it takes so long, it's so chaotic and so broken, people are now looking for ways to circumvent and go around. That's part of the major reason we had the Roxham Road issue and that we had the processing center in Cornwall. What I've said is we have to get the national system under control with reasonable time frames, cut the red tape and the bureaucracy and be smarter about it. On the local angle, it was absolute chaos, and I'll just say this on the issue of refugees and asylum seekers. Canadians are compassionate, they want to help, and they know they have a role to a certain degree to help out. When we have a war breakout that's beyond an individual's control living in Syria, when we have a natural disaster hit Turkey, we do have the ability to help hundreds of people come and resettle here and have a second chance at life and frankly save their life. Some people are running out of threat. But the problem is we set people up for failure. When you have the experience in Cornwall and they're being put up in a hotel, they're not being given the proper forms, they're not giving the proper services, they're not helping them get work permits, they're not helping them get all the different things in a system. People are falling through and they're flailing, they're having increased anxiety on the situation. So the government can just organize, even when it comes to refugee support and helping vulnerable people. The system's broken, where there's a lot more we can do to modernize, actually get people set up for success, get them a job, get them into school, get them language training, and look at the labor shortage we've got. The sooner we can get them into work, it's helping our economy, providing them with an income and a foundation for life. So it's extremely broken. It's getting worse, not better. And so when we look at those issues, there's the local issue, what happened, and there's the national issue, what we can do to fix it.
Okay. So just this morning, we heard of a final agreement between PSAC and the federal government. So the PSAC strike that just completed, did your party stand, since your party wasn't very vocal about it, so did your party stand in solidarity with those workers, or do you believe that the strike is hurting the country because it indeed affected many services that people need?
100%. I think it did hurt the country. I mean, we see passports, all the immigration just spoke about. For weeks on end, there was no applications processed for immigration. Canada Revenue Agency, we had tax deadline this week, and the CRA agents are just returning today. It's created absolute chaos and uncertainty. We already had backlogs and everything I've mentioned, and now there's only weeks more of growing backlogs for workers to go back and try to get their head above water, and for Canadians to get a timely response on services. What we've said, and I think the key thing here goes back, I wasn't at the bargaining table going back and forth on the final details of the deal, but the line that Pierre had in his strong way and effective way of putting things is the special type of incompetence here. After 8 years of their government, the size of the cost of the federal public service is increased by 50%. I think it's $20 billion a year more. The number of bureaucrats that we have in Canada at a federal level has gone up by 35%. And our services have never been worse. So people are asking the question. I think we talk about a broken system, and I don't want to overuse that line, but I think it's a key thing here of where people are looking for change and saying we need a different course change here. We have more bureaucracy than ever before. We are spending records amounts of money. We're spending about $110 billion a year more per year than we did before the pandemic started, and our services have never been worse. Immigration backlogs have never been worse. You can never get a hold of somebody at CRA. Passports, if you're leaving, and now we've got 10-year renewals and rushes and trying to figure out what to do. The question is where the Liberals have screwed it up. How can we have so much increase in cost and size and the service never be worse?
Okay, and so that being said, would your party have supported back to work legislation if it was introduced during the last couple of weeks?
So it'd be I hate to say it's hypothetical and not answer the question, but I always say not at the bargaining table. A key thing when you do back to work is how big is the gap between the parties and so forth that way. So there's a lot of internal factors that I would not be, or Conservatives weren't privy to where things are at. Okay. I will say a note, whenever the Conservatives were in power under Stephen Harper, the size of the bureaucracy was maintained and managed at a reasonable level, and there were zero strikes and zero back to work legislation needed for the federal public service in that time. So I'd say when you kind of look at the compare and contrast, I wasn't at the table to know whether if it was would be necessary, but we were able to get deals locked in multiple times over multiple years that avoided the need to do any of the strike or any of that action as well. Of course, as always, that's everybody's preference.
Okay. And so today, on a different issue, today the House is debating a Conservative motion about new allegations of interference from the People's Republic of China. So if passed, the government would be called on to do many things in relation to this. So could you explain the motion for today that's put forward today to our listeners and what the concerns are of Canadians?
Well, so there's two issues here that are equally as concerning. What the Communist Party of China has done, the size and the severity, the magnitude, and the darkness of what they've done in election interference, not only on the actual election campaigns in 2019 and 2021, but also this week, and where this issue has just been a bombshell story, is that consular officials, agents of the Communist Party in China in Toronto, coordinated a campaign to threaten a member of Parliament's family overseas based on a vote that he took in the House of Commons. Every week, the story and the severity and the magnitude and the depth at which Beijing was going in to interfere in our process and now to threaten people and their families is disturbing. The other equally just as bad point that I hammer home is that the Prime Minister and Liberal officials like the Minister of Public Safety, National Security Advisors knew of this. They were briefed, they were told of compromises, they were told of these actions, they were told of these threats, and they literally did nothing. Now, all of a sudden, when the media comes out and puts these bombshell stories out, then they finally acknowledge, then they offer a briefing to the Member of Parliament in detail, way after the fact, after they get caught. So what worries me in this big thing is the trust of the Liberals. The reason they didn't talk about this a lot was because it benefited them. China's openly said, we don't like Conservatives, they're too tough on us, on what we're doing on the international stage, and they're calling us out too bad. So now they literally have confirmed that they are preferring a Liberal government. So they didn't act because it was in their interest. So what the motion says today is a few things about expelling diplomats. We know who the diplomat was. We know that agent is still working in Toronto for the Chinese Communist Party. They should be expelled immediately. There are police stations. Members of Parliament aren't the only ones being threatened. It's very serious in our democratic process when that happens. But we have millions of Canadians of Chinese descent living around the world, particularly in Canada, and they're being threatened by Chinese police stations operating in Canada. Shut them down. There's many things we've called for tangible actions that they could be doing that they're not doing. So the more we learn, the worse it gets. The more they cover it up, the less Canadians trust them. They actually want to see some concrete actions to push back on the serious things the Chinese Communist Party have done on Canadian soil.
Okay, and lastly, I've been wondering this question. Because I haven't really heard about it in the media a lot. But Conservatives have been really hard on the current Liberal government by exposing their scandals and so on. So, and your party has called on the NDP to revoke their support from the government many times. So, when would the Conservative Party put forward a confidence vote against this government, or are you guys waiting on the NDP to kind of make the move?
Confidence votes, but the NDP has said we've actually had a couple where it was hemming and hawing back on the Beijing election interference issue, trying to get the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to testify and forcing that through. The NDP caved and supported the Liberals. The reality is, I think we are fired up and ready to go for an election. I want to make Pierre the Prime Minister and start to tackle some of the things that I've outlined that are broken and start to fix these things. I don't think the Liberals and NDP won an election because they know we've got some momentum behind us. So we're putting opposition day motions out, calling the government out for their failures, proposing what solutions or what we would do different on. The NDP, I think they're not anxious to go to an election, unfortunately. They've been having to wear every single scandal the Liberals have had because they've been voting with them to cover up testimony or to sweep things under the rug or not to have more information and documents produced. So when the next election comes, there's two choices. Technically there's three parties, but there's two choices. The Liberals and NDP are going to own each other's record, the economic record, the carbon tax, housing prices doubling, all of that. And on our side, to be the other contrast. So we're ready for an election when it'll be. To put a confidence vote in, they have a confidence and supply agreement until 2025. We're putting the pressure on the NDP to say, you're going to wear this. Every time you back them up in the budget, every time you're voting to prop them up or not have more investigation or release of a document, we are going to make sure that those NDP MPs, those ridings are going to hear that you might as well vote for the Liberals because the NDP are just propping them up. And I will say to that point, and an interesting tidbit of Pierre's strength. I think he's changing the game of where Conservatives are competitive. I was just in Northern Ontario that has one Conservative MP and then a whole bunch of Liberal and NDP members. The carbon tax is not popular there. C21 gun grab is not popular there. The tax increases, all the different issues, and the fact there's a lot of people that voted for the NDP that did not vote to prop the Liberals up. So I think you're going to see a lot of NDP members vulnerable, and to be conservative, but people will start voting Conservative from NDP, and it'd be some good momentum for us in the next election. Whenever they decide to have it, we'll be ready.
Okay, all right. That was Eric Duncan, Conservative MP for Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry. Thanks very much.
Thanks for coming in today. This has been great.